George Harrison may have smiled for the cameras, but behind the scenes, he endured years of pain and betrayal, mostly at the hands of someone he once called a friend. For much of his time in the Beatles, George was belittled, sidelined, and treated more like a junior employee than a creative equal. One bandmate, in particular, controlled every note George played, mocked his spirituality, and rarely gave his music the respect it deserved. By 1969, the tension exploded. George walked out of the studio, sick of being dismissed. But the deepest betrayal was yet to come. What followed during his darkest personal moments was something George never fully forgave. Born on February 25, 1943, in a tiny house in Liverpool, George entered the world during the 78th straight night of bombing in World War II. His father, Harold, worked long hours as a bus conductor, while his mother, Louise, cleaned offices at night. Their weekly food budget was just 15 shillings. Despite the hardship, George's mother filled their home with warmth and encouragement. Everything changed in 1955 when George, cycling past a house, heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel through an open window. That moment lit a fire in him. At 14, he finally got his first guitar and practiced obsessively, often until his fingers bled. It wasn't long before school faded into the background. George only passed art class, while his teachers wrote that he cared more about guitars than geometry. It was on a Liverpool bus where George met Paul McCartney, who was impressed by George's ability to play 20 flight rock. Soon after, George auditioned for the Quarrymen, the band that would evolve into the Beatles. Though John Lennon initially resisted bringing someone so young into the group, George's talent quickly won him over. With George's arrival, the band began shifting from amateur skiffle to electric rock. He and Paul added pickups to their guitars and bought an El Pico amp, injecting energy into their early sound. As the youngest in the band, George was often treated like a little brother, not an equal, and that dynamic never truly changed. The grueling early days in Hamburg in 1960 were a crucible for the band. At just 17, George played 8-hour sets at grimy clubs, sleeping behind the stage in dirty quarters shared with other bands. It toughened him, and by 1962, he was performing with confidence at venues like the Star Club. When the Beatles performed on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, George had already begun dabbling in songwriting, penning "Don't Bother Me" while recovering from illness. Though he downplayed the song's quality, it marked a turning point. It proved he could write. Yet his creative voice was often suppressed. Lennon and McCartney had an unspoken rule. They wrote the songs. George was usually allowed only 1 or 2 tracks per album, regardless of their quality. The imbalance fueled resentment. Paul and John's names were in every headline, while George was dubbed the Quiet Beatle. Despite his key role in shaping their sound, especially through his growing interest in Indian music and the sitar, he was rarely taken seriously. His spiritual journey was often mocked, particularly by Paul, who dismissed his devotion to Eastern philosophy. George was searching for meaning, trying to ground himself in spirituality, but within the band, he felt invisible. Even when he wrote groundbreaking songs like "Within You, Without You," he recorded alone, the other Beatles uninterested. By 1969, George had had enough. During the Let It Be sessions, he walked out after Paul criticized his guitar playing yet again. Earlier in the week, George had calmly told Paul, "I'll play whatever you want me to play or I won't play at all." His quiet defiance spoke volumes. That same night, he wrote "Wah Wah," a biting commentary on his experience in the band. When he returned 5 days later, it was only under strict conditions. He demanded more creative input and a change of venue. Still, nothing truly changed. The dynamic with Paul grew colder. During the recording of "Hey Jude," George suggested guitar fills after Paul's vocals, only to be told to stop. It stung deeply. Then came Maxwell's "Silver Hammer," which George called fruity and awful. They spent days on it because Paul insisted. Meanwhile, George's masterpiece, Something, finally received recognition. It was the first of his songs released as an A-side, and it reached number 1. 1. Lennon admitted it was the best song on Abbey Road, but it had taken too long for anyone to notice what George had been capable of all along. Outside the studio, George's personal life was unraveling. His marriage to model Pattie Boyd looked perfect from the outside, but cracks soon appeared. Eric Clapton, George's close friend, fell in love with Pattie and wrote Layla to win her over. She eventually left George and married Clapton. But George had his own betrayals. He had an affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. When Ringo found out, George coolly admitted it at a dinner party. It was a painful moment that fractured 2 Beatles' marriages. John Lennon later called it virtual incest. Publicly, George presented himself as a spiritual seeker. But friends described a man plagued by contradictions, peaceful yet angry, enlightened yet indulgent. He dated models, struggled with cocaine use, and chain-smoked 4-packs a day. Despite speaking against materialism, he lived lavishly in a 120-room mansion, collected exotic cars, and traveled with VIP treatment. His 1973 album, Living in the Material World, captured this inner conflict perfectly. Then came his redemption. In 1970, George released All Things Must Pass, a triple album that crushed the charts and proved he didn't need Lennon or McCartney to succeed. Critics called it the war and peace of rock and roll. In 1971, George played slide guitar on John's brutal diss track, How Do You Sleep?, a shot fired directly at Paul. That same year, George organized the first major benefit concert in rock history, the Concert for Bangladesh. With 40,000 attendees and a legendary lineup, it raised millions for humanitarian aid and proved George's ability to use music as a force for good. But legal battles and personal bitterness haunted the band's final years. When Paul sued to dissolve the Beatles in 1970, George sided with John and Ringo, not because he believed the band could continue, but to avoid letting Paul win outright. The band's breakup was final. When the Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, Paul didn't attend. George stood alone, gracefully acknowledging their legacy, but hinting at the wounds that never healed. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001. His final message was simple. Everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait. After a life filled with fame, betrayal, and inner struggle, George never stopped searching for peace. He was more than just the quiet Beatle. He was a fighter, a visionary, and, in the end, a man who refused to be silenced.